Let's dive right into one of the most profound paradoxes in classical literature. When we investigate the origins of ancient Greek metaphysics, we hit an immediate structural wall. The founder of this massive intellectual revolution left behind absolutely zero surviving texts. We're talking about a paradigm-shifting mathematical cosmology that permanently rewired Western thought. Yet, everything we possess comes entirely from fragmented transmissions by later historians, figures like Herodotus, Xenophanes, and Aristotle, alongside much later Neo-Pythagorean biographies by Diogenes Laertius, Porphyry, and Iamblichus. But despite this immense textual void, the core thesis survived. It's a radical reimagining of reality, governed not by capricious gods, but by immutable mathematical structures.
To deconstruct this textless philosophy, we're going to follow a precise six-part academic roadmap. We'll start with the introduction and thematic thesis, then analyze the historical and cultural context, break down the literary composition and style, examine the ethical and philosophical framework, trace the dialectical progression, and finally, evaluate its transmission and enduring legacy.
Let's start with Part 1, Introduction and Thematic Thesis.
The foundational claim here is absolutely staggering. The surviving fragments reveal a highly sophisticated order operating in Magna Graecia that completely discarded mythological explanations for the universe. Instead, they argued that number itself is the ultimate origin and absolute governing structure of reality. Now, this wasn't just math as we think of it today. This was a total ontological shift. Every physical object, every cosmic motion, and every metaphysical truth was structurally dependent on numerical ratios. By stripping away the old epics of Homer and Hesiod, they introduced a deeply analytical, quantifiable grammar to human understanding. Moving to Part 2, the historical and cultural context of Magna Graecia.
A rigorous critique of these fragments demands that we situate this esoteric philosophy directly within the extreme geopolitical volatility of the 6th century BC. These weren't isolated scholars in an ivory tower, they were deeply embedded political actors. The chronological record begins around 570 BC on the Ionian island of Samos. There, oppressive political centralization under the tyrant Polycrates forced a mass emigration. By 530 BC, the geographic center of this movement shifted dramatically across the Mediterranean to Croton, in what is now southern Italy. Here, the esoteric brotherhood didn't just study, they achieved unprecedented socio-political dominance, reaching peak hegemony around 510 BC, right after the violent military destruction of their rival city-state, Sybaris. This vividly illustrates the fatal friction between abstract philosophy and physical politics. You see, this philosophical aristocracy, which was strictly hierarchical and fiercely secretive, was fundamentally unsustainable in an increasingly democratic landscape. Between 500 and 450 BC, severe anti-Pythagorean democratic rebellions erupted all across Magna Graecia. The archaeological and historical records detailed the violent burning of their meeting houses, known as synedria. This explosive civic violence resulted in mass death, forcing the surviving members to flee back to mainland Greece. It abruptly terminated their political hegemony and forced this complex numerical philosophy to survive solely through dispersed, whispered oral traditions.
And that brings us to Part 3, Literary Composition and Style.
Because we lack a primary written corpus, dissecting this movement requires us to analyze exactly how they transmitted their ideas. The textual fragments we rely on today are inherently secondary, heavily dependent on scholarly reconstruction by later Neo-Pythagorean biographers and early classical critics. The founder completely rejected traditional prose and poetic exposition. Instead, the philosophy's literary architecture was defined by a highly controlled, secretive oral tradition, specifically designed to protect esoteric knowledge from the uninitiated public.
Notice the explicit mechanism they used to maintain these boundaries. The community employed a highly bifurcated instructional style. The foundational layer relied entirely on acousmata. These were oral maxims and rigid prescriptive rules dictating the daily rituals and moral boundaries of the community. These weren't reasoned philosophical arguments. They were direct, unyielding commands meant to enforce behavioral uniformity. They ensured that every listener in the outer circle maintained absolute ritual purity, without ever needing to understand the underlying mathematical logic.
But for the inner circle, the method shifted completely. Advanced philosophical concepts were transmitted strictly via symbola, complex symbolic riddles that require deep hermeneutical interpretation. This dual mode of oral tradition structurally guaranteed that core metaphysical and mathematical doctrines remained hidden. These fragments and riddles essentially operated as an impenetrable wall of secrecy, forcing classical historians to decode highly sophisticated geometry and astronomy from mere whispered maxims. Which naturally leads us to Part 4, Ethical and Philosophical Framework.
The internal ethics of the community were governed by a rigid hierarchy that perfectly mirrored their instructional style. Structurally, the order was strictly divided in two. On one side, you had the acousmatiki, the listeners, who adhered strictly to the moral and ritual rules without ever questioning their origin. On the other side were the mathematiki, the advanced inner circle entirely devoted to the rigorous study of geometry, music, and astronomy. This absolute segregation physically embodied their epistemological worldview. Knowledge is tiered, and access to the fundamental mathematical structures of reality is a privilege reserved strictly for the initiated elite.
Elevation within this community demanded severe ascetic discipline. Members were bound by the communal ownership of all goods, which entirely erased individual economic identity. They were also subjected to mandatory periods of complete silence to cultivate mental discipline and prevent any leakage of esoteric doctrines. Furthermore, they strictly enforced dietary prohibitions, most famously against the consumption of meat and beans. Why? Because these were not mere health protocols. They were existential requirements designed to maintain absolute ritual purity, ensuring the mortal body didn't pollute the intellectual pursuit of immortal abstract numerical truths.
This brings us to the core of their internal architecture. Intellectual dissent was structurally impossible. The community demanded absolute, unquestioning obedience to the foundational teachings of the founder. This extreme dogmatism is perfectly preserved in the definitive communal phrase autos epha, meaning he himself said it. This assertion of supreme authority instantly terminated all dialectical debate. It cemented the sect's cult-like devotion to its philosophical patriarch, proving that within this order, the ultimate metric of truth was not peer review, but unquestioned patriarchal decree.
Now let's trace this logic in Part 5, Dialectical Progression.
The internal dialectical logic of this philosophical thesis represents a massive advancement in classical cosmology. The progressive argument begins with a radical metaphysical assertion, the concept of archy. This explicitly establishes that number itself is the ultimate origin governing all physical and cosmic structures. Before this, the archy was typically conceptualized as a physical element, like water or air. By elevating abstract number to the foundational origin of reality, this text completely detaches cosmic order from material substance, fundamentally rewiring how ancient scholars approached physics and ontology.
Building from this mathematical baseline, the philosophy deduces the concept of harmonia. This is the radical, empirical discovery that musical intervals correspond perfectly to mathematical ratios. By plucking a string at specific proportional lengths, they produced harmonious sound, essentially proving the existence of an underlying, quantifiable cosmic order. This is the precise origin of the harmony of the spheres, the cosmological theory arguing that celestial bodies themselves move according to mathematical equations, generating a cosmic symphony entirely imperceptible to the polluted human ear, but fundamentally structuring the entire universe.
This dialectic systematically culminates in sacred geometry, specifically through their profound reverence for the tetractys. This was a triangular arrangement of 10 points distributed sequentially across 4 rows, 1, 2, 3, and 4. To this brotherhood, the tetractys was not just a mathematical curiosity, it was the ultimate divine symbol of universal completeness. It visually proved that the decade, the number 10, contained the entirety of cosmic architecture, seamlessly integrating arithmetic, geometry, and harmonic ratios into one singular, flawless visual proof.
Finally, this macrocosmic numeric architecture is directly applied to the microscopic human condition through the doctrine of metempsychosis. This eschatological framework argued that the immortal soul undergoes repeating, eternal cycles of transmigration and rebirth across both human and animal bodies. Because all life is bound by the exact same underlying mathematical harmony, the soul traverses a continuous biological loop. The strict ascetic rituals and mathematical studies we discussed were specifically designed to purify the soul, eventually allowing it to escape this grueling cycle of rebirth and return to the pure numerical essence of the cosmos.
Finally, we arrive at Part 6, Transmission and Enduring Legacy.
The transmission of this mathematical cosmology permanently rewired the foundational architecture of Western secular philosophy.
While the physical brotherhood in Magna Graecia violently collapsed, their core dialectical arguments survived to profoundly shape Platonic thought. We can see this direct conceptual pipeline explicitly in Plato's classical dialogues. The radical assertion of a mathematically ordered universe provided the precise structural scaffolding for the advanced mathematical cosmology Plato presents in his Timaeus. Moreover, the Brotherhood's rigid ascetic doctrines of ritual purity, alongside the eternal transmigration of the soul, directly informed the rigorous body-soul dualism and secular eschatology articulated in Plato's Phaedrus.
By establishing number as the fundamental grammar of reality, the surviving fragments of this esoteric tradition completely transcended their archaic origins. They provided classical antiquity with its most potent analytical tools, securing a strictly secular legacy that continues to define modern epistemology. Which leaves us with the ultimate philosophical provocation, derived directly from their fragments. If reality is fundamentally constructed of numerical ratios, is mathematics merely a descriptive invention of the human mind? Or is it the intrinsic architectural property of the universe that we are merely uncovering?